Hello again, and thank you for joining us. My name is Michael D. I'm one of the associate pastors here at Morning Star Family Church. I'd like to thank you for joining us on this series that we're going through called Chronicles of the Messiah. This is a series that's been put up by First Fruits of Zion Ministries. If you'd like to learn more about their ministry or get your own copy of these materials, you can go through them with us. I'll be leaving a link in the description area below so you can find out more information. But in this series, what we aim to do is go through the Gospels, and as we go through the Gospels chronologically, we aim to achieve a Hebraic understanding of the Scriptures, what Jesus said, what the Gospels say, so we can truly understand the Gospel, we can truly understand what we're reading and our faith from the proper perspective. This week we are going through lesson 15, which is called the 12. This is where the 12 disciples are commissioned, and we're going to be covering those scriptures and just a little bit of background on each one. We'll be going through today Mark 3:13 through 19, Matthew 10:2 through 4, and Luke 6:12 through 16. Not going through every one of those scriptures, but what we're talking about today will be covered in those scriptures. So before we begin, we're going to pray as we always do, and then we'll get into today's lesson. Father, we come before you again, just thanking you again for another day of life, God, and for giving us new hearts, God, new wills, new minds, Lord, the mind of Christ as we come before you today, continuing to search the scriptures and just coming to seek you and just to know your face, Lord. Now we ask you to bless everything that we're doing today. Help me, God, to speak properly, to represent you accurately, Lord. Help us, God, to grow today. Be with us in our midst today. Thank you, Yeshua. Thank you for all you've done to make this relationship with the Father possible. May you bless this work, and may it be done to give you glory and honor and praise, Lord. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So let's begin by reading Luke 6:12 through 13. Now it came to pass in those days that he went out to the mountain to pray, and continued all night in prayer to God. And when it was day, he called his disciples to himself, and from them he chose 12, whom he also named apostles. So this verse shows us that the night before he selected his 12 apostles, he spent the entire night in prayer, praying over each individual choice that he had to make, bringing each person before the Father, and asking the Father's wisdom over each person. I think this is a detail that we often miss sometimes. We just read the 12 names and just kind of keep going. And this is just one of many examples that shows Yeshua's heart to just to abide in a place of prayer, bring all matters before the Father. And this was an especially important thing he had to do because this involved the selection of the closest men that he would be with during his short time on this earth. And he spent much time in prayer, seeking God's heart and his direction for each particular one. He cared for them that much, and the mission was that much important to him. So I just think it's great that this verse highlights that, and we just spent a moment talking about that. In Mark 3:14 through 15, it says, he appointed 12 that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach, and to have power to heal sickness, and to cast out demons. We often focus on the 12 disciples, but he had many disciples beyond these 12. Reading his account in Luke where he sends out the 70. We go to Acts 1:15 when after Jesus had ascended, and they're trying to pick a new disciple to replace Judas, who killed himself. Said that there were 120 gathered in that room. So if you think about, these are not just people that followed him after he resurrected. There was a big following that he had, but he had an inner 12, and even within those inner 12, he had an inner 3. But again, selecting these 12 was a very critical thing, that he had to make sure that he did them perfectly the way the Father had already ascribed to. They were going to be his elite students, the ones that were the closest to him, had the closest access to him, the most access to him, and to those that he would be speaking these mysteries of heaven. I just also recall now back in John 6, when Jesus gave that really difficult truth about how he's the bread of life, and it says many of his followers left him. So there's many places in the Gospels and in the epistles also, like the writings of Luke and in Acts, where he has many disciples, but there's an inner 12. He granted these inner 12, special supernatural authority, very similar to the authority that he had. He instructs them in Matthew 10:8 to heal the sick, to raise the dead, to cleanse the lepers, and to cast out demons. All things that he himself did. He delegates that authority to them. The 12 uniquely represented Yeshua and his mission. So he sent out those 12. And we also think about how it's also very similar to when he sends them out in the Great Commission. They're extending that similar work. And he says in there, he says, all authority has been given unto me in heaven and earth. And that same authority he has given to them. And as his disciples today, we have that same authority as well. So he calls them sent out ones. He says, I send you out. And that word sent out in the Greek is apostolos, where we get our word apostle from. And apostle just means a sent out one, someone that is sent out on a mission by somebody else as a special agent and a representative of that person. So in the same word actually, it has the same meaning in Judaism. Where in Judaism, that word for what we would call an apostle or apostolos in Greek is a shaliach. And what that means is a sent one or an apostle, just like it does in the Greek. It refers to a legal agent or representative of a man that is dispatched on a mission to represent him and his interests. In the Talmudic rule, Shilach stated that a man's Shilach is like a man himself. An adage is essentially meant a man's Shaliach is the same legal authority as that of himself. So he is sending somebody else out on his behalf, and this person has the legal authority to do everything that this person commissioned to do. It's very similar in our world today of how we would consider a power of attorney, where we can give authority to somebody else to act on our behalf if we cannot be there as we want to be. The sender of such an agent invested the Shaliach with his identity and his authority. So when they go forward, they're going as he is in his authority, in his absence. The rabbis refer to Moses, Elijah, and Ezekiel as the Shilikim, which is a plural of that, of God, because they performed acts ordinarily performed by God alone. So we see overlap with that with Yeshua's ministry as well, where he's doing things very, very unique that not every prophet would do. Rabbis commission their apostles by laying on of hands and in the name of the community sending them. And they ordinarily did not send them alone, but sent them out in pairs. We see that later on in the Gospels where he sends them out in twos. In Numbers 13:2, send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a leader among them. So in that Numbers passage, the Lord instructs Moses to send out these 12 spies, one representing each of the 12 tribes, to spy out the promised land. And interestingly, if you look at the way that those spies are described in rabbinic literature, it refers to them as shilikim, which is the same word. They were apostles that Moses sent out for a divine purpose. They failed in their purpose, but that was their purpose. And the Messiah, a prophet like unto the same pattern that Moses sends out, he selected 12 men representing the 12 tribes of Israel and sent them out as his apostles, as his shilikim. So again, you see Messiah walking in the same pathway of Moses, doing the things that Moses did, but just to a greater fulfillment of what he did. Oftentimes, Moses or the 12 tribes may have failed in a particular way, but then Yeshua walks in the same path and perfectly fulfills it. There's another writing also from the Epistle of Barnabas, which also kind of highlights and ties these events together, and it says, to them he has given authority to preach the good news. There are 12 of them as a witness to the tribes, for there were 12 tribes in Israel. So we see here why he picked 12. It's supposed to be a pattern. It's supposed to be fulfillment of what was done before. And those 12 Galilean men that he chose all represented one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Whether they were of those 12 tribes, we don't know. They may have been, but that's what they represent. It's a pattern that was set before. So this new family, this new group that was formed, it was a family, it was a brotherhood, it was a really close group of men that worked together to learn under Yeshua and to carry out his will. These men would have ate together, lived together, traveled together, worked together, prayed together, and learned together. Very much in a way like how a military does when you come together in the military and you guys form a brotherhood. You guys do everything together. You grow together. You have problems together, but you grow through and you overcome because there's a greater mission that supersedes everything that you're doing and what brings you together. So with that little bit of a foundation laid, we're going to get into these 12 apostles now. We're going to follow, at least for now, Mark 3:16-19, where it lays them all out. Simon, to whom he gave his name Peter, James the son of Zebedee, and John the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder. Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot also, who betrayed him. And they went into a house. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and the book of Acts provides a list of the 12 disciples. Acts missing one because Judas wasn't alive anymore at that time. We're not going to read each list. I'm going to show a graphic a little bit later on to lay all these out. But just using Mark's as an example. Now, if we compare all those different lists, there are some differences in the list. There's minor differences. All the lists agree, though, except on the name of one disciple. Simon Peter always takes the first place in the list, and Judas Iscariot always ranks last in the list. You're going to see this in a second. Before we get into the differences, it's just interesting also. Another thing that we just kind of miss sometimes in English, or maybe we just don't think about these that much, where the fact you have these names and you have like what we would consider nicknames connected to them. And if you've been in the military or any kind of really tight group of people, that usually develops just by being close to people, where you talk, you grow, you learn more of the ins and outs of people, and you just kind of develop these little names, these little nicknames that come along with being so close to people for such a long time. And it's interesting how this commentary puts it, because it says these names ring with authenticity, almost sounding more like thugs in a mafia family, or the assumed names of professional wrestlers than prospective schools of the sages. I just think that's so funny how, again, we don't think about it that way, but that might have been their mentality, or at least that's how it appears. They create the impression of a group of men who spent so much time together with each other, learning and growing. In our modern vernacular, the disciples' nicknames could translate to something like this: The Rock, Johnny Thunderhead, Big Jim, Little Jim, the Twin, Babyface, and Simon the Terrorist. And again, you think about those names in our world today, you can just kind of see how those kind of names have to develop over time. You wouldn't just meet somebody for 5-10 minutes or see him not too often and just give these names to be associated with them. It comes with time, it comes with struggle, it comes with challenge, being together, joking, laughing, and doing life together. So again, that's just another little detail that I think a lot of times we miss as we read through our Bibles and not immersing ourselves into the storyline of that time. So I'm gonna put up an image now, and we're gonna see this image throughout the rest of this lesson. And what this image does, it's gonna compare the list in Mark, Matthew, Luke, and Acts, all the different lists that are provided for the different names of the apostles, and you're gonna see across horizontally the minor differences of each one. Some of them there are no differences, and some of them there are major differences. But we're gonna go through each one. We're not gonna spend a lot of time on each one because, like I said, we've touched on some of these before. But just to kind of highlight some of the differences between each one, make some clarifications and some important distinctions. And also, for many of them, we're going to talk about at least what church history says about how their life ended, where their ministries took them in the different parts of the world. So the first person on this list you'll see is Peter. He's also known as Petros, Kepha, Peter, the son of Jonah. You also had different places. You won't all see all those different names listed here, but throughout the Gospels, you have these other names pop up as well, all associated with the same person of Peter. He, like I said in the beginning, he is always listed first, and he is typically seen as the preeminent disciple of the 12. You'll see that become later on when in the book of Acts, in the early church, you'll see him as taking this prominent role and a prominent spokesperson, the one bringing forth these messages oftentimes from the Holy Spirit. You'll see that. You also have later on in the Gospels when he receives the keys to the kingdom from Yeshua. So a lot of these kind of things just show us that he was viewed as the preeminent apostle. The believers considered him as one of the three pillars, one of those inner three, Peter, James, and John. And according to church historian Eusebius, Peter left Judea and carried on a ministry to the Jews living in the diaspora before he eventually got to Rome, where he spent many years there, living amongst the Roman community and planting the church there. Sometime later, Emperor Nero arrested him, crucified him, and history says that he was crucified upside down on a cross, and that was something that he requested. He said that he was going to get executed on a cross, and he said he was not worthy to die in the same manner in which his Lord did. So he requested to have himself crucified upside down on a cross. At least that's what history says. Next person on the list, number 2, is Andrew. Andrew, son of Jonah. Andrew is Peter's brother. So before becoming a disciple of Yeshua, Andrew was a follower of John the Baptist, and it's primarily through his story that Peter is brought to knowledge of who Yeshua is. The Gospels don't really mention much about Andrew except for the first few chapters of John when he's introduced and he talks about his relationship with John the Baptist. But the writings of Origen tell us that after the disciples dispersed, Andrew preached in Scythia along the Black Sea. Church tradition reports that Andrew suffered martyrdom on an X-shaped cross, either in Scythia or a city of Parthia in Achaia on the northern coast of the Peloponnesian Peninsula. So again, it doesn't say a whole lot about him. Moving on to disciple number 3. James, who is either listed as James or James the son of Zebedee. So English versions always often translate him as James, but his real name would have been Jacob. But we just call him Jacob so we can just be consistent as we refer to him throughout our lessons. Yeshua and the 12 may have differentiated between the two Jameses. Remember, there were two of them, so they had to find a way to distinguish between both of them. As James, the son of Zebedee, which would have been Big James, and Little James, or James the Less, which would have been James, the son of Alphaeus. So the distinction is there. James's mother, Salome, also eventually became a follower of Yeshua. We talked about that in previous lessons. On one occasion, she asked the master to grant her sons places of honor to be seated at his right and his left in his messianic kingdom. Salome was also there when Yeshua died on the cross. She was one of the witnesses. So James, John, and Peter again formed that inner three of the master. Subsequent to his martyrdom, James, the brother of the master, seems to have replaced James, the son of Zebedee, in that position. So again, there are two Jameses, and at this point in the story, Jesus' brother James isn't even in the picture because he didn't even acknowledge who he was. So this is another James that we have, or another Jacob we have, where eventually these actually replace each other in prominence. And Herod Agrippa had James beheaded and made him the first of the 12 to suffer martyrdom. So that's something interesting about him. So number 4, John, the brother of James, John his brother, or just John. And this is John of Zebedee. So this is the same John that we associate with writing the book of John, the book of Revelation, the epistles of John. And according to church legend, he is the only disciple to have never married. And according to church legend, he is also the only one to possibly never have experienced martyrdom. We're not 100% sure on that. But after the resurrection, John played an important role in the early days of the Jerusalem church. Eventually, according to church legend, he went to Ephesus, where he played a prominent role there until he was arrested by the Emperor Domitian, and he was imprisoned in Patmos. We read about that in the book of Revelation. After the Emperor Domitian died, his successor released all his political prisoners, and then John went back to Ephesus, where he spent the remaining years of his life there. Church legend says that he died he lived into the days of the Emperor Trajan. His reign began in 98 AD. So this is why we believe that John possibly joined Jesus very, very young, possibly as a teenager, because of how long he actually lived. So before we move on to the next disciples that we're going to cover, talk a little bit about these brothers, James and John. Mark 3:17 says, James the son of Zebedee and John the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder. So that distinction, it does not show up on our chart here, but it shows up, in a different place. But these two brothers had this nickname that they were the sons of thunder. So that term, the Boanerges, is a transliteration from like the Hebrew or the Aramaic. The first 3 syllables, bonai, apparently come from the Hebrew, which means sons of. And the second half, we're not really sure, but there are some words that give us possibilities. It can mean commotion, it can mean anger, it can mean earthquake or noise, or it can mean thunder. So some people suggest that the names may have been a reflection of their boisterous character. And again, we think about how nicknames get associated with people. The brothers may have been hot-headed, may have had tempers. They may have been quick to jump the gun and to do things, kind of like how Peter was. They may have also been under the influence of the Zealot movement. Again, we're not sure. But this was something that was happening nearby to where they lived. And they may have been eager to take up arms and to go against Rome. A lot of Jesus' disciples, looking for a Messiah, saw the Messiah as this person that was going to be this conquering king to overthrow the oppressors. So that may have been their initial motivation to join him. But by referring to them as the sons of thunder, another answer to that may have also been from their experience they had with him on the Mount of Transfiguration, where the thunder shook and God spoke forth from heaven. So it could be any of these things. We're not sure, but that name's associated with them nonetheless. Now we can move on to Philip, our next disciple. So if we look across our list here, Philip is just listed as Philip in all these 4 different writings. Philip's name's a Greek name. It just means horse-loving. And church history doesn't say a whole lot about him. According to church history, Philip carried the gospel to Greece, Syria, and Phrygia. And that's all we really know for certain. Let's move on to our next disciple. Like Philip, Bartholomew, number 6 on our list, is just listed as Bartholomew in all these different accounts. But if we go to John 1:45 through 50, Nathanael of Cana is listed. And Christian tradition assumes that Nathanael of Cana is the same person as Bartholomew. So Bartholomew simply transliterates as son of Ptolemy. According to Eusebius, he traveled to India, which could be anywhere east of Ethiopia, as far as how people in that time reckoned geography, where he took with him a copy of Matthew's Gospel, which was probably the original was a Hebrew copy. Other traditions have him in Ethiopia, Mesopotamia, Armenia, different places. Said to have been beheaded eventually, wherever he ended up his life at. And the Armenian Apostolic Church considers him a patron saint. So that also gives credence to say he was in that area as well. Moving on to our next apostle. We have Matthew, number 7, Matthew the tax collector. So Matthew has a common name during this time in history. It's a common Levitical name and a priestly name. The Hebrew original would have been Mattiyahu or Mattia, which means gift of God. Herod Antipas employed him as a tax collector in this region where he was living at. Other disciples of those 2 villages knew him as a traitorous collaborator and extortionist. We talked in previous lessons before about how hated the tax collectors were and how difficult it must have been for him to assimilate into this group of Jesus's disciples. Irenaeus tells us that Matthew preached the gospel among the Jewish people for 15 years. And Eusebius also gives us more insight into his history as well. And this is what he says. Matthew had begun by preaching to Hebrews, and when he had made up his mind to go to others too, he committed his own gospel to writing in his native tongue, which would have been Hebrew, so that for those with whom he was no longer present, the gap left in his departure was filled by what he wrote. He also says Matthew compiled the oracles of the Lord in the Hebrew language, and each subsequent gospel writer interpreted them as best he could. So that right there tells us a little bit that most Christians don't know about. It shows us Matthew's obedience, because Yeshua, when he ascended, told his disciples to first bring the gospel to Judea, which he did faithfully for 15 years. But when he decided to leave, that purposed him to write his gospel, so that way when he left the region, there was something left in his absence that those left behind could still use and could still learn from his experiences. According to the Talmud, the Sanhedrin executed 5 disciples of Yeshua, and one of them was named Mattai, which may have been him, but again, it was a common name, so we're not 100% sure on that. Move on to our next disciple, Thomas. Thomas is number 8 on our list and is just listed as Thomas across the board in all 4 accounts. So his name Thomas comes from the Aramaic form of Toma, which means twin. And sources about Thomas explain that his real name was Yehuda, which is Judas, but twin was the nickname. Early traditions report that Thomas or Yehuda bore a striking physical resemblance to Yeshua. So one of the reasons why he may have been called a twin was because people mistook him physically for who Jesus was. Gospel readers remember that Thomas, that he was the one that was who we refer to as doubting Thomas. He was the one that questioned the ascension of Jesus after he rose from the dead. Eusebius reports that the apostles chose him to go to Parthia, which was where we would consider India. It's like to the very far east. And strong early traditions insist he carried the Gospels far into the east, as far as India, where he eventually met martyrdom, where he was pierced by spears. And he is still remembered today by Christians in the East as Master Thomas. In the same way that Western Christianity looks to Peter and Paul as people of prominence in the church, Eastern Christianity looks to Thomas the same way. And there are churches that are still there today, from what I understand, in Western India, that were there from the time of Thomas. So there's a really strong tradition that was where he went, and that was where he was eventually martyred. Let's go on to our next apostle. We have number 9, which all 4 accounts list as just James, the son of Alphaeus. So he may have been referred to as James, the son of Alphaeus, because remember, there's another James in the group, or another Jacob in the group, we should say. So this may have been a way to distinguish between the two. This would have been who we refer to as Little James. The Bible offers no other information about him, and neither does church history tell us anything about him. So there's not a whole lot we can really say about him. Let's move on to our next one. We have Thaddeus, or Judas of James. The Gospel of John refers to him as Judas, not Iscariot, because remember, we have another Judas coming. In order to keep them from confusing this Judas with the other Judas, they refer to him by 2 other nicknames, Thaddeus and Lebbaeus. So Thaddeus is based upon the word breast, which is often, that word is often put together with describing a nursing baby as nursing on the breast, or a bosom buddy, somebody that's close. Lebbaeus also means heart, dear heart, or what the commentators here have as lovey-kins, like one of those cute little pet names. I don't know where that would have came from. According to early church legend, the Apostle Thomas said that Thaddeus was sent to a city of Edessa, where he planted a Syriac church in that area. And according to Armenian legend, Judas, or Thaddeus, suffered martyrdom in Beirut, Lebanon, together with Simon the Zealot, who is our next apostle. So as number 11 on the list, he is listed as Simon the Canaanian, or Simon who is called the Zealot. The King James translators chose to translate his name as Simon the Canaanite, but if you look at what Canaan means, which is where it comes from, it means zealot. So he may not have been from Cana, he may not have been a Canaanite, it may have just been a transliteration issue with what that original word meant. But as a zealot, he could have been known as just Simon the terrorist, because that's what zealots were. They were freedom fighters for their country. And Simon the Zealot probably saw Yeshua as somebody to stand behind, who he saw as a potential leader of this zealot movement to overthrow Rome, as some of the other disciples may have been also. Before we move on to our next and our final one, I want to talk a little bit just about the zealot movement, because there's a really important point here that we need to highlight. So Josephus explained the zealots. They say that God is to be their only ruler and Lord. They do not fear any manner of death, nor are they unwilling to sacrifice the lives of their families and friends. We know that in the year 6 AD, Judas of Galilee launched a brief-lived revolt under the slogan, "God alone rules Israel, not Rome." And we have this corroborated in Acts 5:37, where it says, after this man, Judas of Galilee, rose up in the days of the census and drew away many people after him. He also perished, and all who obeyed him were dispersed. So the point I would like to emphasize here is that the zealots continued to preach their message, which was God alone reigns over Israel, which is a message that was very similar to what Yeshua's message was. So that's why there was great potential there for misunderstanding. There was great potential there for the Romans to hear this and to think he was challenging their authority. There was great misunderstanding for zealots to think that he was this military leader. So there was a lot of confusion, and it had to be a lot of distinction made between Yeshua, his ministry, and the movement of the zealots. And just finishing up on Simon the Zealot, we talked a little bit a few minutes ago about how the Armenian tradition has Simon martyred in Beirut with Judas, the son of James. So that's how he ended his life. And our final one, Judas Iscariot, number 12, he's listed as Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. No one knows for sure what Iscariot means. Like Simon the Zealot, he may have been somebody that initially got behind Yeshua because he saw him as this leader that was going to overthrow Rome. And we know towards the end of the Gospels that what really sets him off to go to seek the Pharisees and to sell him for the 30 pieces of silver is the fact that when the money is wasted, or in his perspective, the money was wasted when the perfume was poured out upon his feet, and he said the money could have been used to give to the poor, but it's that event that triggers him. So we see his heart in that. But he served as the treasurer of the 12. He held the money bag, made the necessary purchases, distributed alms. He may have been a touch overweight, and here's a historical blurb to show us that. He walked about in this world a sad example of impiety, for his body has swollen to such an extent that he could not pass where a chariot could pass easily. So those are our 12 apostles, the specially 12 that the Master chose after a night of prayer. We're going to see these names pop up more and more again as we go through the Gospels, but this gives us a good foundation, a good orientation to who these men are, their families, their nicknames. It also gives us insights, like we said in the beginning, about the brotherhood, the closeness that existed between them. And just we are thankful for everything that Yeshua did to teach them, to pick them, to draw them together, to send them out, because some way or another we are all connected to them because of their faithfulness, even though so much time has spanned their lives and our lives. And as we wrap this up, this is all I have to cover today, but I want to leave you with a quotation from the book, which is a little bit long, but it's really good. And it really just helps to just put a seal upon this and to just give us a greater appreciation for these men and what they have done. So here's what it says. These are the 12 fishermen, stonemason, tax collectors, 2 terrorists, not the exceptionally pious or educated elite ones might expect. The classic church iconography depicting pious-faced men overshadowed by bright halos obscures the real picture of the 12 ordinary men called to the exceptional life of adventure. Let me just stop there and just say that is a detail that if you ever watch a series of Chosen highlights very well. We have this image sometimes of these guys just being these holy, perfect people, and that is not who they were in the beginning. It took a lot of refinement, a lot of testing, a lot of trial to get them to that place where they were ready to receive death for their convictions. It goes on. They knew the Master better than any human beings have ever been privileged to do. They walked with him, experienced the power of God with him, faced danger with him, shared joys and sorrows with him. Their eyes saw and their ears heard what many prophets and righteous men desired to see, but did not. They kept the Sabbath with the Master. They slept in the Sukkah with him. They made the Passover Seder with him. They gave up their careers, sacrificing everything, jeopardizing your families, financial standings, all in order to follow Yeshua, to memorize his words, to learn his traditions, to imitate his actions, and to raise up more disciples after them. According to church legends, several years after the ascension, the remaining survivors of the 12 fanned out across the world to deliver the gospels to the nations. Most of them paid for that endeavor with their lives. But thanks to their efforts, today, we may all number ourselves among the disciples of Yeshua. They are our brothers. I just think that is just such a wonderful way to end this and to really have something to meditate upon, just how privileged they were for the relationship they had, how dedicated they were for what they did, and how their dedication took them to the ends of the earth, literally, and how it eventually cost most of them their lives. It's a lesson to us all. So again, that's where we're going to stop today. I pray this lesson has been a blessing for you. It might have been a little bit shorter than normal, but we're going to make up for it next week, because next week we're talking about the Sermon on the Mount, which is going to be a lot. So until then, I pray you continue to search the scriptures. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for being a part of this. Pray you're growing and learning. See you next time. God bless, and y'all take care.